I got my first job when I was 13 years old, slinging hot dogs at the county fair. I've worked in food service, retail, construction, and have even done a little mechanic work. People go to work to make money to support themselves and their families. They may love their job, or they may not, but it needs to be done either way. We go to work every day, confident in our ability to carry out our job and make it home to our families. Sometimes, though, we clock in for work and never clock out.
The atomic age was born. There is no denying that since that moment, the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives. All men of goodwill earnestly hope that a realistic control of atomic weapons can and will be achieved. Meanwhile, good sense requires that all of us prepare for any eventuality. But wisdom demands, too, that we take time to understand this force. Because here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command. And where was it science found that giant? In the atom.
On January 3, 1961, John Burns was working in the Stationary Low-Power Nuclear Reactor No. 1, or SL-1, west of Idaho Falls, Idaho. He was working in a three-man crew along with his supervisor, Richard Legg, and a trainee, Richard McKinley. The reactor had been shut down for 11 days over the holidays, and the crew were preparing to turn it back on. In order to do that, the main control rod needed to be lifted and reconnected to the drive mechanism. The control rod weighed 84 pounds, and it was important that John didn't lift it more than 4 inches. It was a simple task, but things hadn't been going right for John. First, John was stationed with Richard Legg, a man he hated. Not only was he stationed with him, but Richard had recently become shift supervisor, and this was his first shift working as his subordinate. They had both arrived at the National Reactor Testing Station in October of 1959, and they butted heads from the beginning. To make matters worse, John and his wife Arlene had been fighting for the past year, and it had gotten so bad in the last 2 days that John had slept on a friend's couch. This had already made John distracted at work, but then Arlene called him at 7 p.m. and told him she wanted a divorce. When the call was over, it was just under 2 hours before they were ready to restart the reactor. As John hunched over the control rod, ready to pull it up, Richard hovered over him from behind. Richard McKinley was pacing nearby. It didn't help that the boron strips inside the core were deteriorating, and it made the rods harder to move. It's unclear if that was a factor in this case, but at 9:01 p.m., John pulled up the rod and went too far, causing the reactor to explode. The Cold War brought with it a competitiveness that pushed advancements in technology. The United States military wasn't only looking for a way to make the most powerful weapons, but they needed better tools to allow them to get a leg up on the competition. The Navy was researching nuclear technology to make submarines that could travel further while completely submerged. The Air Force was researching nuclear technology to create a bomber that could remain in the air for days at a time. The Army wanted to create small, portable nuclear reactors that could be used in Arctic areas to power radar bases. This was what the U.S. Army was working on at the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho. Up until 1942, Idaho was a scarcely populated state that survived on mining and agriculture. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States military decided to take advantage of some of the state's wide-open spaces. One of the first Japanese internment camps was built near Twin Falls. The Minidoka internment camp was on 33,000 acres of federal land and housed 9,000 Japanese Americans who were relocated from their homes in Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. The military quickly found more uses for the vast unpopulated spaces that Idaho had to offer. They built a naval ordnance plant so they could manufacture supplies away from the coast in case of another attack. They took 271 square miles and made it the naval proving grounds where they tested 16-inch guns that would normally fire from a battleship. When World War II was over and the U.S. government decided to let the Japanese Americans go home, they began using land in Idaho to develop nuclear power. The first developments were made in order to power naval vessels, but soon experiments started being conducted to develop small portable nuclear reactors for the Army. Richard Legg was born in 1934 and grew up in central Michigan, where his father owned a sawmill. After graduating from high school, Richard enlisted in the Navy and became part of the highly regarded Seabees, which is the Navy's construction battalion. These men build the bases, camps, and other structures the military needs in and out of combat zones. After a few years in the service, Richard read a brochure that said the Army was recruiting men from other military branches to work in its nuclear program. He began training for the program in 1958. Richard arrived in Idaho as a single man but quickly met a woman named Judith Cole. Judith was a young Mormon woman who worked as a stenographer at the National Reactor Testing Station. Despite Richard not being a Mormon, the two got married, and by the beginning of 1961, she was pregnant with their first child. Richard was only 5'6", and many people said he had a bit of a short man complex. He would overassert himself physically. Though his performance allowed him to advance to shift supervisor quickly, his record was not without disciplinary action. The biggest was when he got caught falsifying records to cover for a friend who was absent from his shift. When they got caught, the friend was moved to a different crew and replaced by John Burns. Richard was scheduled to have another meeting about the incident on January 4, 1961. He wouldn't make it to the meeting. John Burns was born in 1938 in Utica, New York. He forged a birth certificate that said he was a year older so he could join the U.S. Army at 17 years old. He married his high school sweetheart, Arlene Cassier, and they had a son together by the time John volunteered for the Army's nuclear program. He had served in Newfoundland, Canada, and must have discovered that he enjoyed the cold. Once development and training was done, the volunteers would be traveling with their portable nuclear reactors to places like Greenland, the Arctic Circle, and Antarctica. While in Idaho, John used every opportunity he could to be away from his wife and son. He took a second job at a local gas station and spent a lot of time in the mountains skiing. He volunteered on the ski patrol in order to ski for free. At home, the couple had frequent arguments, some causing Arlene to throw John's clothes out on the front lawn. During the holiday break, the time period where the SL-1 reactor was shut down, John and Arlene actually did spend some time together. In hindsight, it may have been a last-ditch effort to salvage the relationship. They attended a Christmas party for the staff of the testing station. Then, John and Arlene went to a New Year's Eve party which seemed to go well because the next day the couple went on a skiing trip together. When they got home that evening, neighbors reported an intense fight where Arlene went to a neighbor's house to call the police. While she was gone, John left and stayed with friends over the next 2 days. On the afternoon of January 3rd, he went to their house to get his paycheck out of the mailbox, but found that Arlene had already taken it. He didn't have time to confront her though, as the holiday break was over and his shift started at 4 p.m. The rest of that day didn't turn out any better for John. He worked his first shift under a man he hated, and his wife called him to tell him she wanted a divorce. For 50 years, there have been rumors that John Burns intentionally pulled the control rod too far to kill himself and Richard Legg. Richard McKinley was just collateral damage. Some have even claimed that Richard Legg was having an affair with Arlene and that's what led to the murder-suicide. But that theory has never been proven. It was investigated, however. The morning that Arlene was notified of her husband's death, she told people that John had told her that the reactor would explode and he would die. He told her to have an acquaintance help her invest her money in the event of his death. Interviews with friends and neighbors confirmed that John's life was in a rocky place and his marriage was not doing well. One friend revealed that he and John had downed a couple of beers not long before he went to his shift at the reactor on January 3rd. No official conclusion about whether or not John Burns intentionally caused the explosion at SL-1 was ever released. It's also unknown if John knew what would happen if the control rod was pulled up more than 4 inches. He knew he wasn't supposed to pull it up that far. He surely knew it would be problematic. But did he know that it would cause the reactor to explode? Many of the people working on or around the reactor didn't seem to have much knowledge of how the reactor worked. They were simply following step-by-step instructions and recording information. Some claim that the murder-suicide story was made up by the Atomic Energy Commission to hide the details of the poorly designed reactor, because if it wasn't intentional, the other options are equipment failure or human error. But wouldn't a nuclear reactor without safety measures to ensure human error couldn't happen be a poor design? What other people say is that the core had a number of strips made out of boron and those were crumbling. This debris could get stuck around the control rod, making it stick. That meant John had to pull a little harder to get the control rod to move, and it's possible that it came loose as he was using more force, causing it to rise too fast. Why wouldn't there be some sort of stop installed that would keep the control rod from being able to be pulled past the 4-inch mark? As soon as the control rod was pulled up too far, the reactor went critical. In 4 milliseconds, it spiked at 20 gigawatts, 6,300 times its safe operating capacity. The fuel heated to 2,000 degrees Celsius in an instant and flashed the water into steam, creating 10,000 pounds per square inch of force on the lid of the unit. The explosion of water and steam knocked John and Richard McKinley to the floor, killing John instantly. Richard Legg was standing over one of the control arms and the shield plug was shot up, entering Richard's groin, exiting his shoulder, and pinning him to the ceiling of the building. The alarm sounded at the National Reactor Testing Station firehouse at 9:01 p.m. The alarm was frequently set off by heat, radiation, or a pressure surge, so firefighters didn't panic when they prepared to answer their 3rd alarm that day. They jumped into the fire engine and made the 9-minute journey to SL-1. The gate that secured the area around the reactor was locked and it was unmanned at night. The procedure for the firefighters at night was to go inside the guardhouse and call the control room so one of the crewmen inside SL-1 could come out and open the gate. While implementing this plan, the most obvious question was apparently never asked, that being, what if the crew members were injured? Since that was the case in this situation, nobody answered the phone, so the firefighters had to call a security guard at a different location who drove to SL-1 and unlocked the gate. Because why rush? From the outside, the firefighters didn't observe anything out of the ordinary. When they entered the building, they noticed a warning light was flashing, indicating high levels of radiation. They donned protective gear and went back into the building. The radiation detector they brought with them was maxed out, which they originally thought might be a mistake, so they went back to the truck to swap it out for another one, only for it to display the same reading. Firefighters found Richard McKinley first as he was still alive and making noise. Rescuers hurried and pulled debris off of him to get him out of the building. As they did, one of them saw John on the floor nearby. When they checked his pulse, they announced that he was dead. They finally got Richard out of the building and into an ambulance, but it barely made it down the road when a doctor stopped the ambulance and ordered the crew to evacuate the vehicle. He went inside to check Richard's vitals, but he had already died. The doctor used a high-level radiation meter and found that Richard's body was emitting a lethal amount of radiation. They wrapped a lead blanket around the ambulance driver and had him drive it a half a mile into the middle of nowhere and leave it for the time being. The crew managed to get John's body out of the building, and he, along with Richard, were eventually sent to the chemical processing plant, where they were placed inside steel tanks filled with alcohol and ice. It was believed that that would reduce the contamination. Despite rumors the ambulance was buried, it was in fact decontaminated and returned to service. Richard Legg's body was finally discovered, pinned to the ceiling. But rescuers weren't sure how they were going to get him down. The rescuers were only allowed to be in the building for a maximum of 60 seconds, and he was suspended over an open nuclear reactor. Engineers were worried that anything falling into the reactor could set off another critical event. They had to slow down and come up with a plan before they retrieved Richard's body. It took 5 days for engineers to come up with a plan, and on January 8th, a team of volunteers began the process of recovering Richard's body. They made a large canvas stretcher that was attached to the end of a crane. They inserted the boom arm through a service door, and the stretcher was positioned underneath Richard's body. Then a team of 10 soldiers using poles with hooks on the end took turns inside for 65 seconds, working to remove the body from the ceiling. The fourth team to rotate inside the building got him free, and the body fell into the stretcher. Then they placed Richard's body into a casket specifically made with 4-inch thick lead walls and transported him to the chemical processing plant, where he joined the rest of his crew. One thing noted by rescuers was that, even though it had been 6 days since the accident when they finally recovered Richard's body, it was perfectly preserved. He was so radioactive that his body was completely sterile. No bacteria could live on his body to cause decomposition. When the accident happened, the people directly involved in controlling the reactors, as long as the emergency crews, had no idea they could emit the radiation levels they did. Rescuers originally brought radiation detectors that measured up to 25 roentgens per hour, and they all pegged at the max reading. To compare, at the time, it was considered safe for workers to receive 0.3 of a roentgen per week, so 25 per hour was bad enough. But when they went back to the fire truck and grabbed the bigger radiation detector, the one that could read up to 500 roentgens per hour, it also pegged at the max reading. They couldn't get an accurate reading because that's the biggest detector they had at the time. Nobody who worked around the reactors could imagine needing to measure radiation levels higher than that, so their minds would probably be blown in 1986 when areas around Chernobyl would measure more than 10,000 roentgens per hour. Due to this massive underestimation of how much radiation their reactor could produce, they didn't really know how to clean it up or what to do with the 3 highly irradiated bodies they had stored in chemicals, something that wasn't helping at all to reduce the radiation levels of the bodies. The family members of the crews had been notified about their deaths in the early morning hours after the explosion, and in the days that followed they began asking when they would be able to bury their loved ones. They couldn't just hand over 3 radioactive bodies to the families, and they, in turn, couldn't just bury them in the ground to contaminate everything around them. After an autopsy, the medical examiner cut away the most radioactive parts of the crew members' bodies until what was left was no longer at lethal levels. Then they washed what was left, which wasn't much, to remove as much of the radioactive particles that they could. The removed body parts were put into a steel drum, which was put into a lead box, which was taken out to a remote area and buried. The bodies were then wrapped in cotton and then wrapped in 2,500 pounds of lead. They were placed into hermetically sealed steel coffins. Richard Legg's casket was sent to Michigan to be buried near his family. John Burns' casket was sent to New York for the same reason, and Richard McKinley's casket was sent to Virginia to be buried in the Arlington National Cemetery. He had served in Korea and was killed while on duty. All of the funerals were specially prepared so nobody had any contact with the caskets before they were buried. Now the people in charge of the nuclear testing facility had to figure out what to do with the damaged reactor and anything else that was radioactive. They had no idea how much radiation the explosion emitted or where it went. Had the wind blown it into Idaho Falls, 50 miles away? Maybe it didn't make it that far, but there was a small town only 15 miles away, ironically called Atomic City. Was the town now a true atomic city? Authorities sent up a small Cessna that was equipped with detectors to track radiation. They began running grids over the area surrounding the SL-1 reactor the day after the explosion. Fortunately, the aircraft got readings of radiation only twice what the normal background radiation is on the planet. They could also see that the outer structure around the reactor was intact, so none of the fission materials were released in the explosion. News in the areas around the test site reported that radiation was only detected in areas immediately around the reactor, most of which was likely tracked around by rescue crews. The people that lived in the area never seemed overly concerned, another sign that people at the time didn't really understand what they were dealing with. In the 1950s, human beings were just setting off large nuclear explosions in the Nevada desert with the attitude of, we'll do it out in the middle of nowhere. It'll be fine. That led to the town of St. George, Utah, receiving a great deal of fallout, causing cancer rates to increase significantly from the 1950s to the 1980s. The explosion did lead members of Congress to debate how nuclear reactors should be used and how close they should be to populated areas. It led to a large anti-nuclear movement in the 60s and 70s. The Army canceled their plans to develop a portable nuclear reactor, and the Air Force canceled their plans for a nuclear-powered aircraft. The Navy was the only branch to continue on with its research, and it led to the development of nuclear-powered naval vessels. Soon after the explosion, the SL-1 building was decontaminated and repaired. Every fixture and piece of furniture was removed, washed in a heavy detergent, and put back in the building. The office was used for a while, but after the Army abandoned their nuclear reactor program, the building sat empty for many years. 20 years after the explosion, the SL-1 building was finally torn down. The contractor that did the work said he believed that he saw the ghosts of the 3 men in the building while demolition was going on. In 1961, 3 men went to work to do their job, working with something that's danger was misunderstood and underestimated. Whether intentional or by accident, the reactor exploded and those 3 men never went home. We look back on this situation with our current knowledge and think, man, were they crazy for messing with nuclear energy without more safety precautions. But we can only say that because of what we know now. In 50 years, people might be saying, man, I can't believe they were messing with X, Y, and Z in 2022. Somewhere, right now, someone is working with something that's more dangerous than we could ever imagine. When you show up to your job tomorrow, look around. Is it where you work? Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week where we'll take you somewhere sinister.